April 18th, the deadliest mass shooting in Canadian history happened in Nova Scotia. I've got a timeline of events here from Global News. Prior to 10 p.m. April 18th, Gabriel Wortman assaults and binds his longtime girlfriend in Portapique, a community of about 100 people 40 kilometers west of Truro. At some point, she escapes and hides in the woods overnight. At 10:01 p.m., police receive a 911 call about a shooting in rural Portapique, Nova Scotia. 10:26 p.m., officers arrive in Portapique and find bodies on the roads and in homes, as well as buildings on fire. A surviving gunshot victim says the gunman is driving a police cruiser. This is a map of the gunman's route through Portapique and the locations where he killed people. 10:35 p.m., a witness sees a vehicle believed to be the gunman's leaving Portapique through a field. 11:12 p.m., the gunman arrives at an industrial area in Debert, about 26 kilometers from the scene of the shootings. 11:32 p.m., Nova Scotia RCMP announce on Twitter they are responding to a firearms complaint in Portapique and ask people to avoid the area and lock their doors. On Sunday, April 19th, the gunman leaves Portapique and in fact travels across the province of Nova Scotia. 5:43 a.m., the gunman leaves Debert before daybreak. 6:29 a.m., he's seen on video entering the Wentworth area, roughly 60 kilometers north of Portapique. He heads to a home on Hunter Road where he kills 2 men and a woman. He remains at the victim's home for some time, according to the police. Around this same time, his common-law spouse comes out of hiding and calls 911, telling the police he assaulted her before the killing rampage, has several firearms, and that he's wearing an authentic RCMP uniform and driving a replica RCMP vehicle. 8:02 a.m., RCMP say on Twitter that Portapique situation involves an active shooter. 8:54 a.m., RCMP release a photo of the gunman on Twitter and say he's considered armed and dangerous. And here is the RCMP police car that he's driving around. 9:43 a.m., he kills somebody else on Highway 4 and Highway 26. 9:48 a.m., he drives south to a home on Highway 4 in the Glenholm area. The residents call 911 saying they know the shooter. They do not answer the door and he eventually leaves. This is the uniform worn by the gunman and it is an authentic RCMP uniform. As you can see by the third map, he continues across the province. 10:08 a.m., he arrives in Debert. He pulls over a car and kills the driver. Presumably, he managed to pull them over because he was riding around in an RCMP vehicle wearing an RCMP uniform. He continues along Highway 4 and does the same to a second driver. At 10:20 a.m., he's captured on video passing through Truro, and at 10:17 a.m., the police finally share publicly for the first time via Twitter that the gunman may be driving a vehicle that looks like an RCMP cruiser and wearing what appears to be an RCMP uniform. At 10:25 a.m., he stops at a Millbrook fire station, gets out of the vehicle, removes his jacket and puts on a reflective vest, then continues south on Highway 2 through Hilden. At 10:49, he encounters Constable Heidi Stevenson and Constable Chad Morrison in Enfield. The gunman pulls up alongside and shoots Morrison, but not fatally. He heads south on Highway 2nd and collides head-on with Stevenson. He fatally shoots Stevenson after the accident and takes her weapon. A bystander arrives to help, but is killed by the gunman. The gunman takes the bystander's silver SUV. At 11:06 a.m., he's driving south on Highway 102 from Brookfield. He arrives at the home of a female acquaintance, kills her, and leaves, driving her Mazda 3. At 11:23 a.m., the gunman exits the highway and stops at Irving Big Stop gas station, about 100 kilometers south of Portapique. The RCMP say that officers also arrived at that same gas station to refuel and have an encounter with the gunman. The gunman was shot dead by police at 11:26 a.m. Here's the map of everything was going down, starting at Portapique and ending at Enfield. Just for context, south of Enfield here is Halifax. So it seems like he was heading to Halifax, which is one of the larger Canadian cities, but he ended up being stopped before he got there. But remember, he didn't go directly to Truro and then south to Enfield. He actually went north to Wentworth Valley first. Here's what his trip looked like. And this is just me having a bird's eye view of it. But it seems like he was going after specific people at the start of everything. Like if you were going to head south to Halifax, there's no reason you'd go north to Wentworth first. He was probably hitting up small towns to actually kill certain people. And then as he went south to Halifax, he just basically killed whoever got in his way. It's very likely there was probably somebody in Halifax he wanted to kill, but thankfully never had the chance to do so. But again, that's just me guessing. I don't know anything here. We still don't know why he did it, but we can actually make some educated guesses. For example, the person that he bound up but didn't kill was his girlfriend. And it's entirely possible, although not confirmed, just hypothesized at this point, that some of the people he was specifically targeting were old exes or something. Which is why some of the headlines that came out after the shooting said stuff like, "Pandemic of violence, calls mount for recognition of misogyny in Nova Scotia shooting." And I mean, fair enough, a week has gone by since the deadliest shooting in Canadian history, and calls are mounting for acknowledgement of the gender-based violence that occurred as part of the Nova Scotia gunman's rampage. Police didn't clarify until asked by a reporter that the person assaulted was the gunman's girlfriend. So, maybe there is an element of misogyny in this crime. At the very least, an element of domestic violence, for sure. And there's more than just this that we can complain about regarding the RCMP's handling of the incident as it was happening. The RCMP didn't put out alerts province-wide using like an Amber Alert system, which I know Amber Alert is for kidnapped children, but they can still use the Amber Alert system to push notifications to everyone's phone, and there's no reason why you wouldn't push notifications to everyone's phone during an active shooter situation. But they didn't do that. They didn't even update the news. They only offered updates on Twitter. And a lot of these people living out in the sticks north of Halifax, they're going to be older people. They're going to be people who are not necessarily as connected as the city dwellers in Halifax. They're not going to be on Twitter looking for RCMP updates. Of course, there's still some ridiculous ideology coming from the other side as well. We must not dilute this problem by speaking of a single act of rage, but rather recognize that male violence is part of a bigger social problem of entitlement and toxic masculinity. We need to recognize the underlying attitudes and beliefs that tolerate and normalize smaller acts of violence against women and perpetuate an environment that leads to deadly outcomes. Yeah, no, fuck off. I would not do what this man did. And you can't somehow link me to him on the basis of us having the same genitals. Fuck you. Myself and a group of other Nova Scotian feminist activists wrote a response to the lack of feminist analysis and the failure to name the shooter's actions as misogynist violence. Please share. Fuck off, dude. You think the biggest... This is a shooting here, man. There are people dead. You think the biggest problem is a lack of feminist analysis of the situation? So just to quickly recap. Domestic violence between the shooter and his girlfriend. He attacks her. She runs away into the woods to hide. He drives across the province of Nova Scotia, killing people. Some of them were people it seems he specifically sought out. Others seemed to be random bystanders. For example, a few of his early victims included an old hunting friend, as well as somebody that he got into a property dispute with. He had multiple guns. It turns out that none of them were registered to him and they were all illegal. And he also had access to both a police officer's uniform and a replica of a police car. His yearbook from Riverview High School showed that he wanted to be a police officer, but he ended up being a denturist instead. In 2002, he pled guilty to assault. He was sentenced to 9 months of probation and was prohibited from possessing weapons. Presumably, since he couldn't become a police officer himself, he had a hobby of buying law enforcement memorabilia and refurbishing old police cruisers. He had jealousy problems as it relates to his girlfriend. He also struggled with alcohol use, and his denture business was negatively affected by the coronavirus lockdown. With all of this knowledge put together, the person that we're looking at is somebody who was probably unstable, who had an obsession with the police but would probably make a terrible officer, and who was probably an asshole in his own right, but at the same time, still had a bunch of bad stuff happen to him all at once. I'm not saying he's not responsible for what he did. He is obviously 100% responsible for what he did. What I am saying is that the government's response to this seems to be ridiculous. Canada bans assault weapons following worst ever mass shooting. Canadians deserve more than thoughts and prayers, says Prime Minister Trudeau. You know that all of the guns that the Nova Scotia shooter used were already illegal, right? He didn't have a permit for them. Trudeau made the announcement on Friday morning. Effective immediately, it is no longer permitted to buy, sell, transport, import, or use military-grade assault weapons in this country. These weapons were designed for one purpose and one purpose only, to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time. There is no use and no place for such weapons in Canada. Does this mean that the police won't have them either? Or the military? Everything that was said here is true. But I'm not convinced that the only people that should have access to dangerous things are the agents of the state. Do you actually think that just because we're Canada, we're not vulnerable to devolving into a tyranny? Trudeau is frankly kind of ineffectual sometimes. I don't think he would ever actually turn into a straight-up tyrant. But what about the guy that comes after him? What if a radical right government takes control in the next election and imposes a white ethno-state? What if a radical left government takes control next election and wants to round up all the children and start indoctrinating them? It is completely reasonable to want to keep weapons to defend yourself, not just from attackers or robbers or thieves or murderers or whatever, but yes, defend yourself from agents of the state, if the state decides to overstep its bounds. Of course, there are some people that say, hey, you don't need a gun to defend yourself, just call the police. And frankly, that's like saying you don't need a fire extinguisher in your house, just call the fire department. The authorities are the last resort in an emergency, not the first. The first resort is you because you're the one who's there. You're the one who's involved in the emergency. There is always going to be a moral obligation for free people to revolt against tyrants. And here's the worst part about it. Trudeau did this without actually passing any legislation. He didn't get the consent of people that his government represents through Parliament. And it seems like he's using emergency powers granted to him because of the coronavirus pandemic to push this through without any parliamentary oversight. Frankly, something like this should be voted on. But it wasn't. It was simply put into law. Trudeau legally used a different process to do this. It came from an order in council from his cabinet, not through parliamentary legislation. And the reason he did it that way is because he knew that there was going to be at least some pushback from the electorate. So he just sidestepped them. And of course, Trudeau used the usual weasel words from the left. Assault-style firearms designed for military use have no place in our communities. Well, they do if you have to fight against the military, but nonetheless, assault-style firearms. That's not assault rifle. Assault rifle is a very specific thing. This is like how sometimes like Nancy Pelosi and other American leftists use assault weapon rather than assault rifle, because that's not an official term. That can mean anything you want it to mean. That basically means that a gun looks scary because it has like a larger stock, or it's painted black or something, who knows. Next up, you'll be seeing like legitimate hunting rifles being taken away because they're sniper-style firearms or something ridiculous like that. The honest truth is, you can still kill a person using any of the guns that they didn't ban. And in fact, a skilled sharpshooter can kill more people with a hunting rifle than some school shooter in a trench coat with an AR-15. Here's the actual list of guns that have been banned. It's quite long. Here we go, amendments. Let's see. The firearms of the designs commonly known as the SG-550 rifle and SG-551 carbine, and any variants or modified versions of them, including there's a whole ass list here. You have the M16, AR-10, AR-15, M4 carbine, and there's a big ass list of variants. There's in total 1,500 guns that have been banned from Canada. And Trudeau hasn't stopped there. This just came out yesterday. Trudeau says that legislation on municipal handgun bans is coming. I guess he couldn't just force this one through, he had to get a vote on it first. Trudeau defended his assault rifle ban on Sunday and promised to go even further by targeting handguns and tightening border security with new legislation introduced in the Parliament. Yet he stopped short of providing a timeline for when such measures would be introduced, saying only that the federal Liberal government would move forward with legislation when Parliament allows. The government on Friday outlawed a wider range of assault-style weapons. The ban did not require parliamentary approval and was instead published in regulations in the Canada Gazette. We know there is more to do on strengthening gun control in this country, which is why we're going to be moving forward when Parliament allows it with stronger measures around borders, stronger measures around safe storage. Measures around handguns to permit municipalities to ban handguns within their city limits. Legislation will also need to be introduced around a 2-year amnesty and a buyback program that will allow the current owners of assault rifles covered by Friday's ban to receive compensation for turning in the designated firearms or keeping them through a grandfathering process. The Liberal government will move forward on that front at the first opportunity when the House turns its attention to things other than the coronavirus. And so there we have it. A deadly mass shooting by an enraged killer, using guns that were already illegal, guns that he illegally owned, using subterfuge, an RCMP cop car, an RCMP uniform, impersonating an officer, which is already illegal. Everything that he did was already illegal, and that is the justification to ban even more guns in Canada. I completely agree with Canada strengthening the border. Maybe we have to build a wall too, who knows? Guns should not be smuggled cross-border just like people shouldn't be. This whole thing is basically just a smokescreen for more government control. Some of the 1,500 guns on that list are actually already illegal. The Nova Scotia shooter already used illegal firearms. And in fact, most criminals use illegal firearms. Trudeau's buyback program is estimated to cost nearly $1 billion, and Trudeau's already failed at balancing the budget for the past 5 years. Disarming legal, licensed gun owners in Canada will not make anything better. Criminals will still have illegal guns. The difference is, now those people that they attack will no longer be able to defend themselves. I've talked a lot about other countries, other governments, and how they've been dealing with the current crisis situation. I haven't talked much about Canada. Well, here, I'm going to talk about it right now. The Canadian federal government has not had this much power since World War II. Government spending has almost doubled in the past 7 weeks. This is probably one of the largest deficits Canada's ever run. Even as the United States economy opens up, work is still largely banned here. It's the state that decides who gets paid and how much. And if they run out of money, which they have, they simply print more of it. The Canadian economy is crashing, the Canadian dollar is crashing. And with Parliament largely shuttered right now, and all criticisms of government at the moment being ignored because it's apparently not the time, Trudeau enjoys near total freedom from accountability and scrutiny. Trudeau talked about border control when it came to this gun situation. He didn't want any more of those American guns flowing across the border into Canada. Okay, fair enough. What about border control before coronavirus hit us? For 2 months after Canadian military intelligence warned Trudeau of the outbreak, our government left our borders wide open to visitors from coronavirus hotspots. 58,000 people entered Canada from China, including 2,000 from Wuhan. Only 3 of those people were required to have a medical exam. And if you complained about this back then, you were called a racist, a xenophobe. Eat the bat soup, you bigot. Go hug a Chinese person or something. Gun control isn't the only thing Prime Minister Trudeau is trying to ram through during this period. There was in fact a bill empowering him to raise any tax at any time over the next 21 months, without Parliament's permission. He backed down on that one because literally everybody, even members of his own party, did not approve. Another thing they're trying to ram through right now is a bill banning misinformation about coronavirus. Yeah, actual restrictions of speech because of the fucking sniffles, dude. But okay, fine. If we're going to be making it illegal to speak any misinformation about the coronavirus, how about all the misinformation that our government actually put out? How about the Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, saying that face masks did not reduce coronavirus spreading?
Putting a mask on an asymptomatic person is not beneficial, obviously, if you're not infected.
Even though a few weeks later she said the exact opposite.
It is clear that transmission of the virus is happening more often than previously recognized from infected people right before they develop symptoms. There is also evidence that some infected people who never develop symptoms are also able to transmit the virus. With this emerging information, the Special Advisory Committee on COVID-19 has come to a consensus that wearing a non-medical mask, even if you have no symptoms, is an additional measure that you can take to protect others around you.
How about our health minister claiming that closing Canada's borders to coronavirus hotspots would actually worsen the spread somehow? The coronavirus has not altered the laws of economics, nor has it changed human nature. Trudeau amassing all of this centralized control in the Canadian government will only lead Canada to ruin. This gun control nonsense is very important, but it is just the tip of the iceberg. I am sure in the next couple months, as the economic crisis continues, we'll see on Canadian TV, on Canadian news, various economic experts employed by the state telling us that state-controlled economics is the only way forward in this crisis. And of course, we're laymen, we can't question the experts. If we do, we're being hyper-partisan, or we're being distasteful during a time of crisis. Everyone has to unite behind Trudeau, apparently. Anyone who doesn't isn't on Team Canada. Yeah, well, you can piss off with that. It is because I am on Team Canada that I'm opposing all of this authoritarian nonsense. Of all of these various power grabs Trudeau's been attempting during this crisis, the gun control one is the only one that's really stuck, and it probably stuck because of the Nova Scotia shooter. And even though that's still actually terrible, we can only hope he doesn't actually manage to pull off anything else, because the next government already has a lot of damage to undo.